All across America and around the world, this is Veterans Radio. This is Veterans Radio.
Good day. I'm Jim Fausone. I'm the officer of the deck today here on Veterans Radio, and thanks for joining us. We've got some interesting stories for you. We always want to remind you you can find more about Veterans Radio at its Facebook site or at the web, veteransradio.org, where we're on the web 24/7. You can find a lot of our podcasts there as well. We post new ones every Tuesday, so you can get a new story, a new interview, something you didn't know before by going to veteransradio.org. And before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors. First up, we want to thank National Veteran Business Development Council, nvbdc.org. It was established to certify both service-disabled and veteran-owned businesses. You'll find out how they can help your business by going to nvbdc.org. We want to thank Legal Help for Veterans. Legal Help for Veterans fights for veterans' disability rights all across the nation. You can reach them at 800-693-4800 or on the web at legalhelpforveterans.com. We just want to remind you that Veterans Radio podcasts are available on all your favorite streaming platforms, including rss.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Rees Across America Radio. So wherever you are, you can find us, whether it's on your mobile phone or your computer or your laptop, your tablet. But listen in to Veterans Radio Podcasts. We post something new every week, and you're going to find it informative. We want to welcome to Veterans Radio a Marine, Trevor Reed. Trevor, welcome to Veterans Radio.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Well, you have a book out detailing a portion of your life that kind of reads like, I can't believe you lived to write about this. And the book is called Retribution, a U.S. Marine's Fight for Justice from the Russian Gulag to Ukraine's front lines, coming out here in January of 2026. Let's do a little bit about your Marine time, because it layers back into some of the problems you had in Russia. Tell us how a nice kid like you ended up in the Marines and some of your duty stations.
Sure. I guess we can go way back, but whenever I was a kid, I think I wanted to be like a detective with my pet dog. And then September 11th happened, and shortly thereafter, there was all of the footage from Afghanistan and Iraq, and I really started to want to go into the military, and later I found out that my dad had been a Marine, so that was enough for me. I decided that's what I was going to do after high school. I did one semester at a community college after high school, and I decided, okay, this isn't for me. And so I enlisted. I went into the Marine Corps in 2011. And then in boot camp, I got selected to become part of the Presidential Support Program, and went through that whole process, went through infantry school. Then they sent me to additional training at Security Forces School, and then on to 8th and I, where our pre-duty, selection was to guard the commandant and the commandant's house there at the Marine Corps Barracks, Washington. So after my clearance processed, I got sent to Camp David, and I did that for about 18 months. Met the president there, got a couple of photos with the president. It was President Obama at the time. And afterwards, after 18 months, you get basically to choose your next duty station. So I chose to go to the Fleet Marine Force at 3rd Battalion 1st Marines at Camp Pendleton, which was my dad's old unit. Did one deployment with the 15th MEU to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa. I think I only had a month remaining on my contract whenever I got out. And then shortly thereafter, I got hired by Academy, formerly known as Blackwater, to be a contractor for the Diplomatic Security Service in Afghanistan.
You ultimately got out of that aspect of your life and went on to school. Tell us a little bit about the international studies and the languages that you were looking into, because this all leads you to going to meet a woman you met online in Russia. So you got to kind of get us, how did we get from that phase of life over to the next?
Sure. So actually met Lena when I was contracting, when I was in Afghanistan. So a lot of guys would stay out of the U.S. for most of the year because you get a tax break if you stay out of the U.S. for so many days. And a lot of these guys would just go to Europe somewhere and, meet up with girls they hadn't met online. So I met Lena, who was from Moscow. Well, actually, she's from Volgograd, but she lived in Moscow. And we started talking during that time, and she wanted me to come visit Russia, but I was pretty nervous about going to Russia. She was too nervous to come to the United States, so we ended up meeting in Greece. Fell in love there immediately, and then after that, we started a relationship which lasted ultimately for years, but most of the time I was in the US and most of the time she was in Russia, so we would just have to kind of come visit whenever our schedules lined up. I got hurt in Afghanistan, had to come back to the US for surgery for a spinal fusion, and during that time I figured, okay, well, I should get my studies out of the way while I'm back home here in Texas. So I went to the University of North Texas and had planned on transferring to the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M. But for that degree program, they wanted me to have 2 years of a foreign language already completed. And so, my plan was, okay, I'll go to Moscow in the summer. I will study this all summer, and then maybe I can test out of a year and a half or so of Russian.
It makes ultimate sense, right? I'm going to go to Russia. I'm going to be with Lena. I'm going to pick up the Russian language. All of this is well planned out, isn't it, Trevor? I mean, it just makes sense. Nothing could go wrong.
Yeah, I did have some reservations about going at the very last minute, because a former U.S. Marine, or U.S. Marine veteran, I should say, there's no former U.S. Marines, but Paul Whelan was wrongfully detained shortly before I went there. But there wasn't a lot of information about that yet. And, Russia hadn't started to practice hostage diplomacy until Paul Whelan. So,
and this is where you really get caught up in this. You're in Moscow. You get yourself at a going away party. Get yourself a little inebriated. The local police pick you up, and now you're in this web of a Russian legal system that is nothing like you've ever experienced. Certainly nothing. And this was the fascinating part of the book for me. What was this whole, what really amounts to like 3 years or 4 years of your life, where you're caught up in this Russian web of legal system, sentencing, time in prison. This is why you should read the book, folks. Retribution, a U.S. Marines Fight for Justice from the Russian Gulag to Ukraine's front lines. But I don't know how you even tell a little bit of this story to our listeners, Trevor, but give it a try.
Sure. I guess I'll start off whenever I was detained. So it's not actually illegal to be drunk in public in Russia. I think that's more of like a national pastime. But
exactly.
And I don't think the police wanted, the role that they would ultimately play in this. I did actually get the opportunity to talk to them later about this, but they took me to the police station basically to sober up, and in the morning I was free to leave. I didn't think that I could get home to Lena's apartment. So you understand, like, my phone I could only use my phone with Wi-Fi. And I didn't speak Russian well enough yet to be able to get back, I thought. So I asked the police lieutenant for Wi-Fi, and she said, yeah, sure, you can use our Wi-Fi, but I already called your girlfriend. She's coming to get you. So foolishly, I stayed there in the lobby. I wasn't like in a cell or in handcuffs or arrested or anything. She said I had slept on the floor in her office. But I waited. I think it only took maybe like 10 minutes for Lena to get there. But during that 10-minute time, the shift changed. And when the new police chief came in, he asked, why is there an American in the lobby? And after he talked to them, he was like, okay, you're detained. So they told me I couldn't leave. And then he called I don't know what this word would be in English, but they said the chief of FSB, which I think is the director of FSB in English. So after that, FSB came. They attempted to interrogate me about my service. They didn't ask if I committed a crime or anything like that. And then once they were finished, I think that's when they decided, okay, we're going to use this guy.
Somebody up the chain in Russian intelligence said, oh, we've got another Marine. Let's hang on to him. There's some value there, and this puts you into a crazy legal system, which is described in the book, and how the trial goes, how the lawyers, and it turns out Lena's interested in the law and interning at a Russian law firm, how they try to help, but I'm not sure if it does, right? How your dad comes over to try to help, and one of the things he tries to help with is, just proving up you're a good guy. You're just a solid, guy. You weren't a spy. You weren't this or that. And he gives, and ultimately makes its way to the court, a picture of you in Marine dress at Camp David, I assume, with President Obama, which then just becomes, see, we knew he was a big deal and more than just a little humble Marine. You get sentenced to what, 5 years, 3 years? How long were you sentenced?
Oh, no, they sentenced me to 9 years.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. That was actually the longest sentence that they had ever given out for assault on police officers with serious bodily harm is basically the
made-up charge.
Yeah, the charge. But just so you know, like, obviously the police weren't injured because I didn't assault them. And they looked at all of this evidence, and it seemed like the trial was going pretty well. I think the judge knew, like, okay, this guy didn't do anything. But in the end, it didn't matter. On the very last day before I was sentenced, I think somebody probably called him and told him, or he called somebody, because the next day he came into court and he read the sentence. His hands were shaking, and you could tell he was not the same judge that had been presiding over the case.
Well, you really have to read the book, because you, as you go through it, you're telling me about, the book talks about, you relate how the cops can't, the police, if you will, can't get their story straight. They got to come up with this, attack and grievous bodily harm, but they can't even get that story straight. So, you really end up going, okay, this was somebody up the chain said, hang on to this guy, and they send you off to a Russian Gulag, and the story there is, again, amazing insight into what goes on in Russian prisons. The word's not, this isn't the right word, you can fix it for me here, but like, there's a prison mafia. I don't know what the Russian term for it is. I don't recall and I wouldn't know how to pronounce it. But you have to get their respect, because they really run the place, and you make an amazing decision to say, I'm not cooperating. And that leads to a whole series of problems, doesn't it?
Right. First, I just wanted to be clear, too, the picture with the president, initially I was really angry with my my parents, my dad mostly, for giving the court that. More angry with the State Department, because they ultimately, handed that to the court. I don't think that actually played a role. I found out much later that pretty much as soon as they had detained me, they had sort of asked the United States, hey, would you like to make an exchange for this guy? So I don't think that ultimately affected anything, but I was really concerned about that at the time. When I was convicted and sent to the forced labor camp, I knew from talking to other prisoners that Mordovia had especially hard prisons, and I told them, hey, I'm not gonna cooperate. I'm not gonna do any of the stuff they want me to do. I'm not gonna work there. And they said, oh, well, we have some guys that do that, but they're gonna be furious, and they're gonna try to break you so that you will do all of this stuff. And I told them that wasn't gonna matter. And when I got to the prison camp, the guy asked, he said, are we gonna have any problems with you? And he's standing there, kind of smirking, and I'm very sure that the response that he normally got was, no, of course not. That's what the old guy who was there with me for the intake said. And I said, yeah, you're going to have it. And he said, what? And I said, yeah, I'm not going to do any of your stuff. I'm not going to follow your regime, and I'm not going to work. And he said, okay, well, then we're going to punish you. Actually, he threatened me. I'm not going to say exactly what he said. That's in the book. But I said, okay, well, that's not going to make a difference. And, his response was kind of, we'll see. So shortly after being there, they started to put me into solitary confinement. And I mean, the conditions there were not good. So it's mostly a concrete floor. There's like a little sink, like a steel sink, I think. Bench that's bolted into the ground. And then you have basically your rack that kind of like folds out of the wall, and it has wooden planks. And then at night, what they'll do is they'll bring in a foam pad kind of thing, which is your bed. And then in the morning, they take that away, and then they fold the bed up into the wall, and then they lock it there with a padlock, so you don't have anything to lay on in the day. And the big issue there is that in the winter, they use the cold as like a weapon against you to try to break you. So it would be probably nearly freezing in there, if not freezing sometimes. And they wouldn't allow you to wear any warming layers or anything like that. So, my day mostly consisted of just kind of snuggling with this hot water pipe to stay warm. And then after about an hour, my back would start to freeze. So I would rotate over to put my back against the hot water pipe and then just do this for a while. The rest of the day, I would kind of walk in circles and then tie like a shirt that I had snuck in there around my head as like a makeshift kind of hood.
It's really just, as I read the book, Trevor, it's just like day-to-day survival. How do I get through today? And I guess when you're facing 9 years, you have to approach it that way. And because of the limitations on time, I'm going to move on to two other issues. One is, and you mentioned it at the top, this prisoner swap, that Russia seems to use U.S. citizens as bargaining chips to get some of their guys back or spies back, whatever it might be. People will remember the name Brittany Griner, who was a women's basketball player who got picked up on a marijuana vape or something, and ultimately was part of a swap. And Paul Whelan, who was a U.S. Marine veteran, a businessman, was over there, I think, for a wedding, and he gets picked up. This is before you, and becomes part. It takes a long time before he becomes part of a prisoner swap, but this goes on today. I just picked up this week an article about a man by the name of Charles Zimmerman, who was handed a 5-year sentence at a Black Sea resort. They found a rifle on his yacht. He had sailed into that port to meet a woman he had met online. The rifle was on the boat, the yacht. He wasn't bringing it on shore. He was using it for self-defense. And they said, oh, well, now you've violated our laws. He's now tied up in that system for 5 years. And 5 years from now, he'll probably be in a prisoner swap. But this is sort of the only way out early, isn't it, out of that 9-year sentence?
It was, yeah. There was, basically no way I was going to get out without that. And, in addition to that, my thought was that they would probably just keep adding charges on to me and basically keep me there forever. I don't know what charges those would have been, but, they
made up the first set. They can make up some more. Now,
exactly.
What year did you get? Did they swap you out?
That was in 2022 in April, and my parents, they did this massive campaign, with the news media, with our congressmen, with the Senate, and eventually that led to a meeting with President Biden at the White House. And, he made the decision of, okay, we're going to do this. I was in really bad health by that point. I don't think I would have lived more than a few more months after the point where I was exchanged. I weighed about 120 pounds when I came back. I had lost nearly 50 pounds of mostly muscle.
And you get back, and I've got to speed this up again because, again, this is one of these stories when each chapter is like, I can't believe you lived through this. You got to come back, you got to get healthy, you've got to put on weight, put on muscle, mentally get back in shape, emotionally. But at some point, you make this decision that you're going to go to Ukraine to fight with them to, if you will, kill Russian soldiers as part of your retribution for what you were put through. Tell us about that phase of life.
Yeah, I knew whenever I was in prison at a certain point that, my goal was no longer to just survive there, but if I ever, made it out of there, I was going to make them pay, for stealing those years for me and my family. Not just that, but also for doing that to the United States, because they were doing this to other Americans as well, and especially friends. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, I was in the forced labor camp, and I actually wasn't in solitary confinement that day, so I saw that happen, and I knew, okay, if I ever get out of here, I'm going to go help the Ukrainians fight them. It wasn't just solely for revenge. It was also, I felt that the Russian government needed to, have a cost imposed on them for hostage diplomacy. And then also the fact that I knew what the Ukrainians were going through, and I knew with my training and experience, I could help them.
And it was not an easy road to get there, because again, you physically, emotionally have to recover. Then you have to find your way into Ukraine and a unit to fight with. But that gets accomplished. And how long are you in Ukraine as a fighter?
I went to Ukraine on November 1st, 2022. So I think around 6 months after I was released. My buddies there in North Texas that I served with in the Marine Corps, they helped me to get back in shape and then get back my combat abilities. I went November 1st. I had a little bit of trouble at first finding a unit to fight with, because all of the guys that I had planned to meet were wounded in combat just before I arrived. So after that, I did a special operations training course, which was about 10 weeks, I think. Might have been 12. After that, I had to get a security clearance processed. I ended up going to another unit during that time because the security clearance was taking too long. Had to redo the security clearance, and then once I received that, I think the day after I arrived at my unit, we began combat operations, and we did that for months and months.
And through this process, internally, emotionally, you're in fighting in Ukraine against Russians. I mean, do you feel like, okay, I'm accomplishing what I wanted to accomplish through these actions? Where do you end up emotionally during this period?
I thought it would be in combat, directly engaging the Russians when I would feel something like that, but it actually wasn't. So the first night that I was in Donbass at the safe house, when I arrived at my unit there to Rogue Team, that was when I had that moment where it was just complete calm and serenity. And I was like, okay, I made it here. Like, I'm going to do what I came here to do, and, live or die. Like, I took my life back from the Russians. I didn't let them, win. And I'm going to be able to move on. So that was it. Just finally getting there. I slept for 9 hours after that. And, before that, I was only able to sleep for 3 or 4 hours a day.
You're in combat for a period of months, but ultimately there's a landmine explosion. You get injured and have to come back to the U.S. Tell us when that was, and kind of, again, emotionally, how big of a letdown was it, or it was like, okay, I've done what I came to do?
No. So on that mission, I actually should have already left. I didn't go to Ukraine with the goal of staying there until the war ended. I knew that was going to take too long. But I set a date to come back because I had been accepted into university, and we had already finished our rotation, and then we're cycling back onto leave and training rotation, and I figured I would leave during that period because there was no reason for me to stay for training. But they called us back last minute. Our the brigade command of the AO we were operating in, and said, "Hey, can we have you come back here and do this last operation with us, this final assault?" And so we said okay, and we turned our trucks back around from going back to Kyiv, staged there, and then did one final assault. And on that final assault was whenever I was wounded. So I was already almost, halfway back to Kyiv before we even did this mission. So it wasn't like I felt like I missed out or anything like that. But
and what month would that have been?
I think that was very late July, maybe like July 30th or 31st or something.
Of 23.
Of 23, yeah.
You now find yourself back in I got to get medical care, I got to get back, and the plans for school kind of shift. Throughout this process, you get pretty limited or almost no help from the U.S. government. They weren't keen on having U.S. citizens on the ground fighting in Ukraine, but did you ever kind of get official word from the government, like, "Kid, we didn't want you to do this, we're not going to help you"? Or how did that interaction? Because they did a prisoner swap for you. They probably weren't thrilled that this is where you were.
Yeah, so I want to be clear about that too. I didn't ask the U.S. government for help. Again, that was my parents who did that, even though I specifically asked them not to do that.
Yeah, except they love you, so you know how that went.
Yeah, so they did that on their own, but, I, for one, didn't think that, the U.S. government really was involved in that at all. Didn't think that was their responsibility. And the other thing was, I also knew how the U.S. government worked, and I didn't have like a year to be evacuated. So I found an NGO on my own with.
And I want to thank everybody for listening to Veterans Radio today. I am Jim Fausone. It's been a pleasure to be your host. I'm a veterans disability lawyer at Legal Help for Veterans, and you can reach us at 800-693-4800 or legalhelpforveterans.com on the web. You can follow Veterans Radio on Facebook and listen to its podcasts and internet radio shows
by visiting us at veteransradio.org. That's veteransradio.org. We again want to thank our national sponsors, the National Veterans Business Development Council, nvbdc.org. Legal Help for Veterans, a veterans disability law firm with a national practice before the VA, can help you on your claims and your appeals. It can be reached at legalhelpforveterans.com or 1-800-693-4800. We also want to thank our local sponsors. This would include the Charles S. Kettles chapter of the Vietnam Veterans of America, that's chapter 310. VFW Graf O'Hara Post 423, the American Legion Irwin Preskin Post 46 in Ann Arbor as well, the VA Ann Arbor Healthcare System, and certainly the National Vietnam Veterans of America Association. You can be a sponsor by going to veteransradio.org, clicking on the About Us and our sponsors, and help us out. Keep this program alive for the 21 and 22 years. Keep us going for another 20. Thank you.